Yes! What's up, everyone? Welcome to Lowered Expectations. Thanks for lowering your expectations and hanging out with me here. I do appreciate it. As the title of the video suggests, I am going to be replacing the motor on my diesel heater today. That might be a little bit strange for those of you who watch my channel regularly, because I'm normally performing some sort of crazy experiment trying to burn waste motor oil. Well, all of those experiments are the reason why I am finally replacing my motor. And I've recently had to replace my ECU as well. I've overheated this motor and ECU several times and it finally quit on me. The motor quit on me and the ECU also quit on me. So, not the fault of the heater, not the fault of the ECU, and not the fault of the motor. 100% my fault for doing all of these crazy tests. I would suggest that you guys don't do the same unless you're willing to replace a bunch of parts as well. That being said, if you are interested in picking up one of these handy dandy, incredibly serviceable and durable heaters, I have an affiliate link in the description below. If you purchase a heater using that link, it helps me out. I get a small kickback. There is also a discount code in the description below, VVS10 for $10 off your purchase, or VV promo for 5% off store-wide. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, all the information in the description below, feel free to check that out. Before we get into it, some of you may have noticed that this is a fairly long video for a motor replacement, and there are a few reasons for that. Firstly, this is a fairly detailed motor replacement video on both removing and installing the new motor, but a big part of the reason this is so long is because at the end of the video, I actually decided to tear apart the old motor, show you guys what was wrong with it, and tear apart a new motor and show you guys what they look like inside and give a brief explanation of it. So if you feel like skipping out on that part, go ahead. Before we take the heater down off the shelf and tear it apart, I'm first going to take a look at this motor and see if it matches up at all. I ordered this motor from Wish and it got here surprisingly quickly. It wasn't supposed to be here for, at least another week, a little over a week. So it's here and I am pleased. Let's see if it's destroyed. It looks to be the same motor and it's not destroyed, so that's cool. As you guys will notice during the disassembly process, I have done a few modifications to my heater. I may touch on them briefly just to avoid a whole lot of confusion. And I'm not going to show dismounting it from anything because all installations are different. I simply have mine sitting up on a shelf. You might have yours in a caravan or a trailer or outside of your shed. So I'm not going to show that process. We're going to start by pulling the end cap off. This is very easy. This is an ingenious idea. That screws off, then you simply pull this cover off here. That lid comes off, you want to set that aside. And then you simply pull the grommet out on the ECU cable, and the heater will pop right out of the body. Yours will probably come loose a little bit easier than mine because mine has this extra line here for preheating the fuel. This is a modification that I made to mine because I'm running a waste oil mix in it, or experimenting with a waste oil mix. I recommend you do not do the same. The oil and diesel come in through here. They get preheated up to about 100 Celsius, and then they go through this loop and into the heater. So we're going to remove this to get it out of the way. Comes off fairly easily, just like that. And that is a piece that yours will not have. We're going to grab a 4mm Allen key and remove the bolt from the ECU. There's only one bolt holding it on. Pull that out and set it aside. I like to use this thing as a nice little tray for my bolts. Then we simply pull out on the bottom and this will slide out off of the top piece here. remove the glow plug, the heat sensor, and the motor connection. If you're not familiar with the way yours hooks up, you might want to take a picture of it beforehand so that you get it back together properly. Although if you do hook yours up wrong, I'm pretty sure it will just give you an error, and then you'll simply have to take it apart and plug it in the correct way. Now we're going to take that same 4mm Allen key and remove the fan housing, these 4 bolts around the top. It is surprising how easy these things really are to work on, and it's a good thing because I've had to take mine apart a lot to clean carbon out of it because of my foolish experiments. Alright, we can now set this part aside. This is what we're going to be working with. The motor is right here, and in order to get to the bolts that hold it on, we need to remove this fan. So the easiest way that I found to do that is simply pull on it a little bit. Yours might be tighter than mine, but pull on it a little bit and rotate the blower fan here, and this pulley will pop right off just like that. Now for the other fan, you might have to do a little bit more pulling. I've found that to be true for mine, but it too just pulls off like that. Now we've got this plastic piece here. This pulls off, just give it a wiggle back and forth. I've seen some people use screwdrivers to pry this off, but yeah, just a little wiggle and that comes off. Set all of our parts aside. Here are the bolts, screws, whatever you call them, that hold on the motor itself, and they are a Torx. I do not have that tool ready, so I will come back when I find it, and then I'll tell you guys what it is. I found the tool to take these bolts out, and it is in fact a 3mm Allen key. I'm going to crack these all loose and then spin them out. I may have mentioned earlier that these were Torx. I was confused. The bolts that hold the motor itself together are Torx. The bolts that hold the motor onto the housing are 3mm Allen keys, although yours may be different. All right. We now have the motor removed. If you stick around to the end of the video, we'll actually pull this apart. I'll show you guys how to take this apart, and we'll look inside to see what is actually wrong with it. But for now, we're going to start reassembly. To reinstall the motor, it's basically just the reverse of how we took it apart, although there are a few things to keep in mind, so we'll go over the whole process. Slide the motor into place with the wire in the little cutout for the wire. We get our 3mm bolts, drop them into place, grab our 3mm Allen key, start each bolt before we tighten any one of them. It's always a smart thing to do. We've got all 3 started. And now we can tighten them up. Keep in mind that these are fairly small bolts. You want to make sure that they're tight, but you don't want to overdo it and strip out the motor or strip out the head of the bolt. Now that we have the motor fastened in place, we need to reinstall this little doohickey. Not sure what it's called, but it slides on just like this. There is a little cutaway here that matches up with this cutaway, and there's actually a little tab there that needs to go right up against that edge. So just like that, wiggle it into place, and if you put this on too far, you can always make a correction, but I believe it's supposed to go so that there's little clips that kind of go in those grooves. Yours might be different, that's the way mine is. Now, to install the fan, this just pushes back on. The way mine works is the end of the fan lines up perfectly or is flush with the shaft on the motor. So we push this on until that is flush, and mine is flush right now. You might have to tap yours on with a hammer or something. If you do, be careful to actually set this shaft against something so that when you tap on it, you're tapping through the shaft and not into the housing of the motor, because that could damage something. So you want to be mindful of that. If you have to tap on the fan, make sure to put the shaft against something before you tap. This fan goes on a lot easier for me than the other one. I don't know if it will for you, but this is how I do it. I simply grab the blower fan here, grab the other fan, push in and give it a little twist. I like to run my fan quite close to the housing. I think that it makes it more efficient or makes it move more air. So I like to keep my fan really close. So I push it in just close enough that it's almost touching. It's actually touching there. So you can see I went too far. We can just pull it back out a little bit and we get to the point where it's not rubbing. We don't hear any scratching sounds, and it is still running really close. Now that this is all reassembled, all we need to do is bolt it back onto the heater housing, just like this. We're going to ignore the rest of my modifications because this is not a video about those modifications. If you want to check that stuff out, feel free to check out my channel, subscribe, and all that good stuff. Be happy to have you. So we grab our 4mm Allen key, spin these bolts back in, multitask and spin one bolt in with the Allen key and one in with your fingers, just to speed up the process. Just like that. Again, you want to make sure these bolts are tight, but not so tight that you strip them out. They are fairly small bolts, and aluminum isn't the hardest material, so be careful not to strip them out. Make sure they're snug. It is now time to reinstall our ECU. The way I do this, I always plug in the glow plug first because it has the stiffest wires. Then I grab my heat sensor and the motor connection, which is the one that we just put in right here. Brand new shiny. Put that in place. And we clip the ECU in on the top here. Get the wires out of the way so we're not pinching anything. And then install the one bolt that holds the ECU on. This is going into aluminum, but it is holding on a piece of plastic. So you want to be very careful tightening this up so you don't crush it. Be gentle. There we go. This is all basically assembled, so now we're going to pop it back into the housing. My heater, I am preheating the fuel, so I am going to put this piece back in place. If you're not preheating your fuel using a piece of automotive brake line, then you can skip this step. I pop that in like that, run it through there. Hook that fuel line up like that, and then we can slide this into the case. It's a little bit more tricky to slide into the case with the modification that I've done here, but it still goes in pretty easy most of the time. Once you get the body of the heater wiggled back into the case, you want to make sure that you get your grommet put in place. This grommet goes into the case here. And you also want to make sure that your little supports are in the right place in the case. There's an aluminum one on each side of the fan housing there, and then there are little ones on the outside of the fan here and here. One on the top here and one on the bottom, but as long as you have these two lined up, the other ones will be lined up as well. Now all we need to do is pop this cover back on. Just like so. There is a lip in the cover. There is a groove in the cover on the bottom here, and if you don't get that right, you're going to have troubles getting your cover on. So if it doesn't go on pretty easy for you, make sure to check that you have that lined up. So that groove, one goes on top, one goes on the bottom of the red, just like that. Fits in place, and then thread your end cap on. And you're back together. Now install the heater the same way that you took it out. Before we move on to disassembling the motors, I wanted to point out that it is very important that your fans are not rubbing on anything. The combustion fan could be rubbing on the fan housing if you've pushed it on too far, or if it is slightly warped, or it could rub on the grommet around the fuel line if you do not have that grommet installed properly. The exterior fan could be rubbing on a number of things, including the case, wiring, or anything else that isn't installed properly. The fan rubbing on anything will cause extra load on the motor, causing extra heat in the motor, and at the same time, because the fan won't be turning as fast from the extra load, it won't be cooling as well, so you're going to have a bad day. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take this motor apart and take a look inside, because I think this is actually a little bit better quality motor than it came with. It is held together with Phillips screws and not Torx. So let's pull this apart. I'll probably put this at the end of the video, just because not everyone wants to see this, but the reason why I think this is a little bit better quality motor is because it actually has little vibration dampers on the bearing. I can see that quite clearly by looking at it. And this one does not have such a thing. So let's take a quick peek inside. I wouldn't necessarily recommend taking your new motor apart because there is a chance that you could damage it. When you pull the motor apart, the brushes, which are going to sit on this end, could get damaged, especially if you don't know what you're doing when you're putting it back together. They can get damaged. I'll try to show you guys that as good as possible, but I would just recommend that you don't take your new motor apart. So I'm going to push on the shaft with my finger here and push the armature out of the housing like that. The reason why I'm doing that is because this part of the motor sits in the brushes. The brushes, which are located here and here in the brush holders, are how the electricity actually gets to the rotating assembly. So the positive comes in on the red, negative comes in on the black, travel through, and one wire is connected to one brush and the other wire is connected to the other brush. I will pull the armature or the rotor out of the brushes now. You'll see they are spring loaded and they actually snap in when I pull the rotor out. Just like that. These are the brushes themselves. These are made out of some sort of graphite material or a graphite mix, and they sit in the brush holders. This is the part that is damaged in the other motor. The wires come in from the positive and negative connections here and here, and one connects to each brush. There are little springs, one for each brush, that keep them pushing in, making contact with the rotating assembly on what I believe they call is the commutator. So the way this works is positive power gets fed to one side, negative power gets fed to the other side, and that makes an electromagnet in the rotating assembly. Because there are magnets in the housing, you have north and south poles attracting each other and same poles repelling each other, which causes the motor to spin. So now we're going to put this back together. If you were foolish like me and decided to take your motor apart, your new motor or your old motor that didn't need to be replaced, so the brushes are touching together and you gently use some sort of small pick or something to get them to come apart just a little bit. Once you have them apart a little bit, you can get the shaft of the motor in. Once again, making sure your washers are in place, you slide the shaft in, and very gently you want to either just allow the weight of the rotor to sit on the brushes, or just a slight pressure with your fingers, and then what you do is start working the brushes back and forth just a little bit. Hopefully I'm in frame here. So you work the brushes just bit by bit, and as you work them back and forth, just a little bit of pressure down on the rotating assembly, the rotor, and eventually you'll get to the point where it slides into place. and everything is fine and dandy. Now that you have the rotating assembly installed in the end cap and the brushes installed correctly, you're still not home free. You want to make sure that the end cap is secured in place and that it doesn't fall off. Any movement here could cause the brushes to come dislodged, and then you'll have to start all over from square one. So what you want to do is make sure that the end cap is fully seated in. Grab the shaft quite firmly and even take a couple of fingers maybe and push in on the cap. Then you want to locate the cut or the groove in the housing to go around the wire and the grommet and slide the housing on. Before you slide the housing on, keep in mind that this is a magnet and this is magnetic. So when it gets close, it's going to try to pull its way in, which is going to try to pull this shaft out. So the magnets are going to try to pull the shaft out of your fingers, and if you're not holding it fairly tight, it could just pull it out and pull it out of the brushes. So here we go. I'm going to brace my finger on the rotor a little bit, slide it into place, and make sure I don't pinch the wires down here. Now, I've got the magnet sitting in place, but I need to get that grommet into that groove. And if I just pull out on this without holding the shaft, once again, that's going to pull the rotor out of the brushes. So we don't want to do that. Want to make sure that we pinch the shaft, hold the end cap down, and then we're going to make just a little bit of space so that we can wiggle the grommet into place. I'm going to need a little bit more space than that apparently. As I'm doing this, I'm thinking I could just grab the pick and push that rubber into place, but I want to show you guys that you can do it like this. There we go. Grommet is in place exactly where it's supposed to be, and the rotor is still in the brushes, sitting in the proper location. So we are good. Now we need to rotate these bolt holes so that they line up so that the bolts can actually go through. Now we want to take the end cap again, make sure all your washers are in place, that you didn't lose any. Make sure the bearing's seated and slide the end cap on just like that. Now you want to make sure you hold everything together securely. Make sure these bolt holes are lined up. So we've got, let's see now, there's one here and one here. I think I might actually be lined up. Put our bolts in, make sure our washers are on. And then thread our bolts in. It can be a little bit tricky to get these to line up, so you want to rotate the end cap and look in there to see if you're actually anywhere close. Once you can see the end of the bolt, then you can kind of get one started, move over to the other one, do the same thing, look in the end, see if you can see the end of the bolt, and get it started. Once you get them both started, hold the end caps together, and then snug up these bolts. All right, one new motor reassembled. As you guys can hear, we've got the heater running in the background. So now that we've got that taken care of, we can tear this motor apart, take a quick look inside and see what it looks like. I've already had this apart and repaired. I use that word loosely, but I've had this apart and jimmy rigged the brushes so that they would work. May or may not actually be able to tell because all I did is heat up the brush holders with a heat gun and then push them into place. I actually did have to file away some melted material, so maybe that will show up. Anyway, let's pop these bolts out just like so. Hold that end cap on, pull this one off. I was wrong, this one actually does have a damper built into it and I just didn't see it. There we go. So these bearings are good. I have spare bearings. The end cap, well, I can't imagine one of those would ever go bad. And the rotor itself could be bad. The brushes, I don't know if the camera will pick up on this, but they've definitely definitely seen better days. When you remove the rotor out of a brush assembly, the brushes are actually supposed to pop in, but you can see on this they are not going anywhere. Well, they finally do when I push in on them, but they should move back and forth quite freely. But like I said, they had previously melted. So I'm going to release these springs and take them off. Whoops, that's the wrong way, Joel. There we go. I'm going to throw them into my little parts container and keep them just in case I ever lose the brushes out of the other motor, which is never going to happen, Joel. Why would you do that? Now, I am going to take that bearing out of that side. In order to do that, I need to pry off this plastic piece, I do believe. I don't know why I'm filming this, because it's never going to get used. Nobody wants to see this. Alright, can we pry this brush holder off of here without removing my fingers as well? I'm sure there is a place where you're supposed to pry to pull this off. Actually, it's probably not ever supposed to come apart, but that's not going to stop us, is it? Okay, the brush holder assembly thingy is off, and now we can push this bearing out of here. It just falls right out. Interesting. There's no damper on this side, oddly enough. I doubt that anyone will ever try to replace these bearings by number, and they'll probably just look for Chinese diesel heater motor bearings if they decide to do that and not just get a new motor. But I'm going to tell you guys what the number is anyway. The number on this bearing is 625Z or 625Z, depending on where you're from. And it looks like the bearing brand is All Out, A-L-L-O-U-T. Interesting. That's going to do it for this video. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. If you enjoyed what you saw, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more crazy nonsense, well, subscribe to my channel. In most of my videos, as I said at the first, I am doing all sorts of crazy experiments trying to get my heater to burn waste motor oil. If that's not something that you'd be interested in, well, maybe this channel isn't for you, but thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.